Podcast number 1, Introduction to Stress. Stress is basically a state of psychological and physical tension that happens when there's a mismatch between the perceived demands of a situation and an individual's perceived ability to cope. This state of tension can either be adaptive, in which case it's called eustress, or it can be maladaptive, in which case we call it distress. A stressor is basically an event that starts the stress response because it throws the body out of balance and forces it to respond. It's subjective because it doesn't produce the same response in all people. For example, someone may find skydiving really stressful, someone else might not. So basically, nothing is a stressor unless you perceive it to be. There are two different stress responses in the body. The first is the fight or flight response, which uses the sympathomedullary pathway, or SAM, and it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. The ANS is a network of nerve pathways from the brain to all the organs in the body, and it's controlled by the hypothalamus. It usually maintains normal functioning of body systems in response to the demands of a situation. It has two subdivisions, the sympathetic nervous system, or the SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system. When the sympathetic nervous system is activated, it leads to sympathetic arousal. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, digestive activity slows down, and fats and carbohydrates are mobilized into the bloodstream so that they can be used by muscles. When the parasympathetic branch is activated, the heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down, digestion increases, and basically produces a pattern of bodily calm and relaxation. Now, when the sympathomedullary pathway is activated, the first thing that has to happen is the brain has to perceive the danger or stress. The second thing is the hypothalamus alerts the sympathetic nervous system, which leads to sympathetic arousal. The sympathetic nervous system triggers the adrenal medulla, the center of the adrenal glands, to release adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are arousal hormones. These hormones reinforce the pattern of sympathetic arousal and lead to the fight or flight response. There's an evolutionary explanation as to why we have the fight or flight response. It was vital for our ancestors' survival, as it protected them from harm and allowed them to get food. For example, seeing a saber-toothed cat would lead to the flight response, they'd run away. But if they saw an animal suitable for food, it would lead to the fight response, they'd chase after them. The second stress response is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, or the HPA system. What happens in this system is the brain perceives stress, and this leads to the hypothalamus releasing CRF, or corticotrophin releasing factor. CRF stimulates the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotrophic hormone, ACTH. ACTH travels to the adrenal cortex, the outside of the adrenal glands, and stimulates it to release corticosteroids, for example, cortisol. Corticosteroids lead to high blood pressure, lowered immune response, lowered pain sensitivity, and a burst of energy, so that you can cope with a stressful situation. Selye, 1956, was the first person to try to explain the detrimental effects of bodily stress. He called it General Adaptation Syndrome, GAS. The first stage of the syndrome is that the brain perceives a stressful event, both stress responses are activated, and the body is prepared for fight or flight. The second stage is resistance. The body's stress response is fully activated, it's dealing with the stressor, everything seems to be under control. However, stage 3 happens if the stressor goes on for too long or if it's chronic. Selye thought that at this stage, hormone reserves became depleted, which could lead to potential development of stress-related conditions like raised blood pressure or hypertension, ulcers, depression, or anxiety. Now, there are gender differences in the stress response. For example, Taylor et al. Found that women tend to use the tendon befriend response instead of the fight or flight response. There's an evolutionary explanation as to why there are individual differences. You see, in the past, humans dealt with stress by using fight or flight, which helps the individual survive but puts their offspring at risk of harm. So females, who have a greater investment in their offspring, for example, in pregnancy and then in feeding them, evolved a stress response that doesn't compromise the safety of their young. They instead tend to their young, nurture and protect them, and befriend other females. They seek social contact and support from them as a defensive network against any outside threats. The tend and befriend response can also protect females from the adverse effects of stress. For example, in 2005, 33,000 people in the UK died of coronary heart disease. 70% of them were male. This is because of male and female hormones. The hormone oxytocin is secreted in both sexes as part of the stress response. It reduces the effect of cortisol, which allows you to recover faster after an acute stressor. Male hormones reduce the effect of oxytocin, whilst female hormones amplify it. So males are more vulnerable to detrimental effects of stress. They are more likely to develop stress-related illnesses. The combined effect of tandem befriend and female hormones can protect women against these detrimental effects, which also explains why women live an average of 7.5 years longer than men. And that is your introduction to stress.